Hello, strangers. It's another Tuesday, and I've brought you another true, original, scary story. Something that really happened to a friend of mine. This is story number 62.
Josh and I were best friends. We spent our entire summers looking for trouble to get into. We'd been playing a video game that day, one of the Tony Hawks. The warehouse level struck our fancy for whatever reason. Josh asked if I'd ever snuck into a warehouse. I said no, and he starts acting all superior, implying he had. Well, I called him out on that immediately. Josh and I spent practically all of our time together that summer. It was one big sleepover that didn't end so much as switch locations. I knew for a fact Josh hadn't been urban exploring. He laughed and confessed, but insisted there was a warehouse out in the industrial area of town that we could visit. His father and mother were one of those realtor-contractor duos. They'd recently acquired a warehouse to add to their portfolio. It was when industrial chic was becoming a trend. They had plans to section it off into condos that went for half the value of the space itself. However, their plans were on hold while the city trundled through the process of rezoning the building from industrial to residential. In the interim, the warehouse sat vacant of people, locked and such, to ensure no vandalism or vagrancy. Per Josh, the previous owner was a snack cake manufacturer, and wouldn't you know it, they'd left behind some boxes of their goods. I was getting more and more hyped about this plan. Not only did rummaging around an empty warehouse sound fun, but now I was told there may be snacks. Josh and I powered off the game. He went and rooted around in his parents' cabinet to find the key, and thus prepared, we swung our legs over our respective bikes and pedaled away. From the outside, the warehouse was unremarkable. It was a gray brick of a building squatting on the outskirts of a dozen other metal buildings in gray, faded white, and that odd powder blue that appears to be the only pastel allowed in such an otherwise macho setting. We leaned our bikes against the building nearest, a Quonset hut in a dingy orange, and Josh clicked through the combo lock on the exterior door to obtain that key. It only took him 2 tries to guess the combination to it, his birthday. And hey presto, the key was in his hand, turning in the lock. Once the exterior doors were open, the key he'd pocketed from his parents' cabinet back home got us inside. The warehouse door creaked as we pushed it open. It must have had pneumonic hinges or something. When we released it, the door caught itself from slamming behind us. It made this futuristic whoosh-click sound as it closed. We clicked on our flashlights and began wandering deeper into the building. His parents must have been planning to show it soon. The climate control was on, but it was set just a bit too high to really defeat the early July heat. I was already hot and sweaty from the bike ride over, and while the cool air felt good, I could still feel my shirt sticking to me as we moved. The layout of the warehouse was simple. It had a reception lobby, and beyond that, a narrow hallway. On either side of the hallway were locker rooms. Further down on the right were a set of offices. On the left, what we guessed from the counters and cabinets might have been the older break room. Beyond reception, locker rooms, and offices break room, the hallway ended in a pair of double doors that opened onto the main warehouse floor. Josh and I dinked around in the offices for a while, but there wasn't much there beyond desks and chairs coated in a fine layer of dust. It was the anticipation of the treasures awaiting us on the warehouse floor that kept us moving. We reached the 2 doors, traded a look, and swung them open. The air was stale, like no one had been there in years. Dust had settled everywhere. It even left a layer on the push bar on the back of the door. I glanced at the push bar and saw a few handprints, thin smeared tracks in the dust. I took this as evidence that Josh's parents had been through here recently. That relaxed me a bit. After all, we weren't supposed to be creeping around on their rental properties. And as empty as it was, the warehouse was spooky. As I exchanged another look with Josh, I saw that heightened excitement on his face too. But we'd already come this far. We moved on through the warehouse floor. And true to Josh's word, the warehouse hadn't been emptied yet. A long conveyor belt snaked around abandoned dollies and empty boxes. A row of taped boxes stacked against the far wall beckoned us. We started towards them, figuring that the stacks of taped boxes were our best bet for where the abandoned snack cakes would be. I whispered to Josh as we picked our way over through the boxes and other obstacles. It was so still, whispering just seemed appropriate. I asked Josh if he thought the food would be rotten. Josh whispered back, "Nah." His parents had purchased the warehouse only a month or so back. Given all the preservatives, those snack cakes should be fine up until the second coming, in his estimation. But as we walked over to those taped-up boxes, I couldn't smell rotting food. I could, however, smell something else. Something bad. Josh's nose wrinkled as he scented it too. Without confirming it verbally, Josh and I both slowed our gait, creeping quietly up to the boxes. The smell got worse. Josh said something like, the heat must have spoiled them, or he started to say that. He got as far as spoiled before the beam of his flashlight glinted off of something. It was an empty, discarded bottle, a 40-ouncer, which shouldn't be there. He looked at me, his wide eyes bugging out from his face, skin looking paler than I'd ever seen him look. I probably looked about the same as I aimed my flashlight further, discovering more trash, a crumpled ball of some sort of clothing, a boot sticking out from under a moving blanket. The way it was arranged, it kind of looked like a cheap Halloween decoration. Out of nerves, I wanted to laugh, point out how cheesy it looked, but I couldn't, because really, it didn't look all that cheesy. There was a shape under the blanket. When people did this boot and blanket thing for scary decorations, they usually just stuck boots and gloves under the edges and left the rest of the blanket lying flat. But this wasn't flat. As I was thinking this over, Josh's flashlight skimmed over the boot and found its mate. My heart dropped. The sweat misting my skin felt heavy and cold. We were both inching closer, leaning in to see while hoping to God not to see what, with every passing moment, this looked more and more like. The smell had concentrated here, like it was hunkered down in this one spot, the nest of boxes trapping the bad air. The 2 boots ran into 2 shapes, long thin ones, that met under the blanket, conjoining into one thick shape. Josh and I looked at each other again, gulped, slowly crept to the top of the blanket where the thick shape had thinned to a single round shape. The smell was so stifling the longer we stood there. I swallowed until my throat clicked, trying to clear the rot, the BO, and the sickly smell and taste from my nose and mouth. but all my spit had dried up. I watched Josh reach out to pinch the edge of the moving blanket between thumb and forefinger and pull it aside and up a little. The 2 seconds of dawning comprehension were followed by a smell that hit like a physical slap. It was so thick, it felt like a weight in my mouth. I stumbled back as Josh did, dropping the blanket. The blanket covered the sight we'd glimpsed. The sight of a waxy top of the scalp where a bald spot shone like cheese left out of the fridge, surrounded by a mess of silver and gray hair. And below this, enough of a face that we saw eyes. Eyes that were slitted open, staring at nothing. They were flat and roomy, like water covered in scum. I sprang back, dashing a few paces away towards the conveyor belt. Josh was close behind. We were scared, confused, but struck completely silent by shock. And that silence may have saved us. Because as we stood, exhaling as hard as we could to clear crumbs of that choking smell from our noses, a sound reverberated in the tall-ceilinged warehouse. I looked up and saw that one of the windows along the top of this room was open, which allowed the sound of a car door to echo through the warehouse, where a tall, tarp-covered shape loomed in another crowd of boxes. Unlike the nest of boxes where the body lay like a child asleep in a box fort, these boxes were assembled, but clearly empty. If I had to guess, this was the beginning of the assembly line of this warehouse when it still operated. The boxes were hastily built at this end and likely put on the conveyor belt here to ride past the warehouse workers, where the boxes were collected, filled, and ended up on the other side, where they were taped. Josh and I dashed to the tall tarp-covered shape and lifted it, being greeted by the heavy musk of machinery, oil, and other dull chemical smells. It was some kind of forklift. I started to say something to Josh as he bent, scurried under the tarp, and hid by one of the massive prongs of the machine, but another sound, a door opening, kept my lips sealed shut. I followed Josh's lead. I flattened myself against the forklift and let the heavy canvas tarp fall over my shape. I huddled, trying to be as small as possible. Sweat was immediately beading on my upper lip. It was stiflingly hot under the tarp, yet the heat left my body as we heard a cluster of footsteps, louder and louder, and then the twin doors to the warehouse swinging open, followed by more footsteps and their echoes. We could see nothing, and the adrenaline heightened our other senses. I could hear the scuffle as one of the people drug his heavy feet as he walked. The other two, I think there were two, strode normally. They paused. There were some muffled voices. I could tell they were men, but their words were lost. Just harsh, low sounds. Then, more footsteps. They were heading away from us. They were heading in the direction of the body. Boxes were moved aside, I could hear that much. There was a louder remark, something about "what a smell," rang out. It was met by muffled laughter, dry as coughing. There were more sounds, rustling, dragging. Sweat was running in my eyes, stinging them. I clamped them shut, invoking the universal kid protective charm. If I can't see it, then it can't see me. Not that anything was visible under that stifling tarp. There was another sound. It was crinkly and plasticky. More huffs and grunts from the men. I couldn't see, but my imagination tried to help out by filling in the blanks. They had gone to the body, and now I heard plastic. Maybe they were wrapping it up to take it somewhere. But why? Covering up a crime? There had been no blood around the body, none that we'd seen. It had looked and smelled like a crime, but now my imagination was course correcting, giving a new route like it was a GPS and I'd shot past my turn. Maybe it was a natural death. Some hobo had broken in to sleep and had died in his sleep like my great uncle had last winter. But then, who were the men who'd showed up to move the body? Why move it? Why would they mess with it and not call the police? And if all of them shouldn't have been here, and I very much doubted they worked with Josh's parents, how did they know the body was here in the first place? My thoughts were interrupted as I heard one of the voices. It was loud and clear because it was close. I'd been so dialed into my own thoughts that I didn't hear anyone stepping in our direction. I felt my insides clench. My guts were squinted shut like my eyes. That low voice said, "What's this?" What? What was he seeing? Had Josh dropped something? Had I? Were there marks, footsteps, evidence of us being there? I had no idea if the man was killed or died on his own, what these men were doing here, whatever they were doing with him. But I'd bet my life they sure didn't want an audience for it. The next few seconds felt like years, as I had time to picture the man following cartoon footprint trails to our obvious, idiotic hiding place. In my imagination, he was holding a giant gun, a .44 or a deagle, something from an action movie. I could see him thumbing off the safety as he brought it level with our shapes under the canvas tarp. How soft, round, and obvious our body shapes must look against the still, blocky shape of the forklift. Then I heard the plastic rustling again. Another man's voice, farther away, said something. The first man's voice, so close he had to be within arm's reach of me, made a sound of disgust and harsh retching. Through his sputtering, I heard him say, "Who would fill red velvet with coconut?" A bray of laughter, and the second voice saying something like, "That's what he got for putting something from here in his mouth." More laughs. Something hit the canvas, something soft that slapped it, dropped, and rolled under it. The footsteps were walking away from us now. Whatever he'd picked up and attempted to eat came to rest when it hit my foot. The voices were talking more, grunting and huffing. The voices and noise of them grew farther and farther away. The doors opened, scuffling, dragging. The doors clicked shut. I don't know how long Josh and I stayed, still and terrified, under the tarp. Was I imagining the car doors outside? Was that an engine rev, or was I making this all up because I wanted them to be gone? Had we heard all the men leave? Or was one of them waiting, maybe scouting for evidence? Just as I decided I needed to find a way to lie down, maybe plan to stay here all night, Josh decided to risk it all and clambered out from under the canvas. I held my breath, waiting to hear him cry out, but he didn't. All I heard was Josh telling me, "Come on, man, they're gone." This was followed by a harsh cough as the disturbed dust hit his throat. I crawled out and hunched in camaraderie by Josh while his throat-clearing coughs passed. I looked back, saw the discarded snack cake's twin, those things always came in a 2-pack, lying inches from where we had hunkered down. I didn't want to check the body. I didn't want to know if they'd taken it. I wanted to throw up and leave and go home and go to bed in that order. But Josh was on the move again, and I followed, eyes cast down, in his wake. The boxes had been moved, shifted into less of a closed circle and more of a horseshoe. The body was gone. What was left behind looked like an oil spot, and that was all. If I hadn't seen the snack cake, evidence of the 3 men who'd visited the warehouse, I would likely have just pretended none of it happened and made myself believe that. End of. We didn't tell Josh's parents what happened. We both would have been in mad trouble for sneaking into one of their properties. But also, the guy was already dead. There was no bringing him back. And with naught for evidence but a discarded snack cake that we'd likely be blamed for as evidence someone had been there, well, imagine how that would go. Here you go, officer. Put out an APB for a guy who doesn't like coconut. It was ridiculous then and even now as I write it. Josh and I never discussed it either. We just sort of knew we had to keep our traps shut. And until now, I guess we did. It's been so long that it doesn't feel real. It feels like a dream I had once, or a book I had to read for 4th grade English. It's faded, but familiar if you hum a few bars, you know? Snack cakes, chocolate coconut ones, make me gag on sight though. That part hasn't faded. That part is crystal clear.
The art of growing up requires the pressing of boundaries, the exploration and discovery of moving outside of a bubble where you've been safe, secure, to sort of test out what the real world is like. So go out there, explore, have your adventures, but take a friend with you. Speaking of, thank you, my friendly strangers, for coming with me here. Like, comment, subscribe. At any rate, I'm happy to have talked with you again. And until next time, take care, strangers.